method of philosophical inquiry. Introduction. In this study section, our focus is to examine the nature of myth. We will also contrast mythical thinking against philosophical thinking. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this section, you should be able to discuss myth in relation to philosophical inquiry, explain the term myth, trace the origin of myth, contrast mythical thinking against philosophical thinking, justification for myth as a method of philosophical inquiry. In this sense, we may begin by stating that mythical thinking is taken as a true objective story, which accepts myth as a sort of allegory. It makes sense to contend that mythical thinking, an activity of the human mind relating to things through myth, represents a way of knowing and understanding. However, myths have been discounted by some as folk stories and so unreliable because they are held to make up a body of assumed knowledge about the universe, the natural and the supernatural worlds. In fact, from the time of the Greek sophists to this day, myths have assumed a rather pejorative and often negative meaning. But we should not forget that even the great Greek philosophers like Plato and Aristotle did not discard mythologies as complete absurdities. The former, for instance, made use of myth as allegories in several of his dialogues, and the latter acknowledged that, with regard to heavenly bodies, some mythical data might correspond to reality. Robert C. Solomon and Kathleen M. Higgins explicate further that the first Greek philosophers were steeped in mythology, and some of the greatest breakthroughs in philosophy made by Pythagoras, Parmenides, and Plato, for example, involved the flat rejection of materialist explanation of the world. They often wrote in riddles and allegories, and they more often sounded like mystic poets that contemporary science professors in modern times, largely owing to the prodigious breakthroughs of science. It is common knowledge that critics often argue that a mythological narrative can embrace contradictions and absurdities. These critics often maintain the empiricist stance and hold the facile assumption that new knowledge about the world cannot be acquired through mythology, since the latter would need only the aid of either intellectual intuition or deductive reasoning for its veracity or meaningfulness. In short, these critics textly fail to see any relation between science or modern knowledge and mythology. However, it is particularly striking to know that modern science did not evolve in its entirety as a rebellion against myth, nor as its birth did it suddenly throw off the shackles of myth. In ancient Greece, the naturalists of Ionia, Western Asia Minor, long regarded as the originators of science, developed views of the universe that were in fact close to the creation myth of their time. Those who laid the foundations of modern science, such as Nicholas of Cusa, Johannes Kepler, Sir Isaac Newton, and Gottfried Leibniz, were absorbed by metaphysical problems of which the traditional, indeed mythological character is evident. The meaning of myth. The term myth has been defined by many scholars in different ways, that its definitions are so varied and irreconcilable. For instance, Bolaji Idowu defines myth as a vehicle conveying a certain fact or a certain basic truth about man's experiences in his encounter with the created order and with regard to man's relation to the suprasensible world. In a similar vein, Anthony Mercatante defines a myth as an anonymous traditional story orally passed on from one generation to the next, believed to be literally true by the culture that produced it about gods and goddesses, heroes, heroines, and other real and fantastic creatures taking place at primeval or remote times. However, Williams Bascom's definition of myth is copious and most illuminating. According to Bascom, myths are prose narratives which, in the society in which they are told, are considered to be truthful account of what happened in the remote past. They are accepted on faith, they are thought to be believed, and they can be cited as authority in answer to ignorance, doubt, or disbelief. Myths are the embodiment of dogma. They are usually sacred, and they are often associated with theology and ritual. Their main characters are animals, deities, or cultural heroes whose actions are set in an earlier world when the earth was different from what it is today, or in another world such as the sky or underworld. From the foregoing, a mythology is therefore a body of myth, especially those dealing with the gods and heroes of a particular people. It should be noted here that people look at myths with different frames of mind or thought patterns since human beings have various ways of relating to things. This means that each mindset or thought pattern will receive or use myth according to its own characteristics. In other words, we may speak of one, mythical thinking, where myth is taken as a true, objective story. Two, rational thinking, which accepts myth as a sort of allegory. Three, symbolic thinking, which finds in myth some of the symbols needed to reach the deep and true side of things. Symbols is itself an expression which receives various meanings or interpretations. What is referred to here is a type of sign which has a special relation to what it signifies. For example, water signifies life or death or cleansing. In short, mythical thinking, which is an activity of the human mind relating to things through myth, represents a way of knowing and understanding. There are, however, different meanings that are attached to the expression myth. It is possible to distinguish at least four meanings of the expression. Myth could mean 1. A story of beginnings. 2. An intuitive, imaginary, usually personified view of life. 3. An image, a parable, an allegory used to explain human life and the world. 4. A legend, a story used by primitive minds who do not know better. Despite these different meanings given to the expression myth, some features that be seen to characterize the understanding of myth. In this vein, mythical thinking can be understood to give form to the world in which people live, thereby liberating them from chaos and from a feeling of insecurity in the cosmos. As such, it unveils the meaning of things, overcoming meaninglessness, and integrating individuals into a totality, society, the universe, the divine, by fostering harmonious relations instead of hostility. It also provides motivation and inspiration in life, particularly in social life, e.g., funeral ceremonies, whereby the dead are believed to look back at how their lives are being celebrated. As a way of knowing, mythical thinking appears to connote a global knowledge referring to everything without going into so many details. It is a participatory kind of thinking in which the person is fully immersed or absorbed, making great use of the imaginary power of the mind. Myth as a way of knowing is received or revived with the help of rites, including gestures, songs, that is lived socially as part of the individuals belonging to a group and transmitted by tradition backed by authority. The origin of myth and some Greek philosophers on myth. A description of the characteristics of mythical thinking leaves open the question of the origin of myth. We have looked at mythical thinking as a method of arriving at some knowledge of the world by use of existing myths. But who produced the myths themselves and how did it all happen? Some people take it for granted that there existed mythopoets or real creators of myths in various societies. The activity of mythopoets can easily be imagined. As such, myths have made as such, myths may have been the result, in some cases, of existential intuitions or of an immediate knowledge of aspects of reality. In other cases, they may represent the outcome of a wise and reflective observation of things by gifted individuals, coupled with an effort to understand what was happening in the world or society. In either case, one could say that the people who consciously produced myths, if that is the way things took place, were not enclosed in some of the limitations proper to mythical thinking. Having looked at a possible understanding of the origin of myths, let us examine some Greek philosophers on the idea of myths. A brief review of the opinions of Greek philosophers on myth confirms the fact that early philosophy in Greece coincided with a certain movement away from myth. Xenophanes of Colophon, known as one of the critics of anthropomorphism and mythology, asserted that people create gods only in their own image and that any animal, if it believed in gods, would picture them as animals. Thus, Xenophanes has left critical reflections about God and the gods. He was taking a distance from traditional religious beliefs. Heraclitus of Ephesus, often referred to as a Greek materialist philosopher and dialectician, wanted people to act or speak as if they were awake, not asleep. What matters in this view is to search for oneself. Democritus of Abdera, also a Greek materialist philosopher and disciple of Leucippus, intended to free people from the fear of the gods and of death, a fear based on wrong beliefs. Plato recognized that some of the traditional myths may be true or may at least contain elements of truth. Plato himself made use of myths as allegories in several of his dialogues. Aristotle had doubts about mythical stories concerning animal life. These stories should be either accepted or rejected after careful and accurate observations of facts. With regard to heavenly bodies, he acknowledged that some mythical data, fruit of genuine insight, might correspond to reality. Philosophical thinking contrasted with mythical thinking. In discussing the contrast between philosophical thinking with mythical thinking, It would be perhaps instructive to begin by looking at the origin of philosophical thinking in relation to mythical thinking. In this vein, Marcia Eliade, a renowned historian of religions, the 1986, states that a conscious and definite process of demythicization took place in pre-Socratic Greece, in Upanishadic India, and in Egypt. According to him, there was indeed a certain moment in history when some people began to lose interest and faith in the divine history transmitted by myths, while claiming still to believe in traditional gods. In his opinion, the history of religions here finds the first example of a conscious and definite process of demythicization. To be sure, even in the archaic cultures, a myth would sometimes be emptied of religious meaning and become a legend or a nursery tale, but other myths remain in force. In any case, in pre-Socratic Greece and Upanishadic India, there was no question of a cultural phenomenon of the first importance, whose consequences have proved to be incalculable. For after this demythization process, the Greek and Brahmanic mythologies could no longer represent for the respective elite of those countries what they had represented for their forefathers. For these elites, the essential was no longer to be sought in the history of the gods, but in a primordial situation preceding that history. It was an attempt to go beyond mythology as divine history in order to reach primal sources from which it was believed the real had flowed, to identify the womb of being. It was in seeking the source, the principle, the archive, that philosophical speculation for a short time coincided with cosmogony, but it was no longer the cosmogonic myth, it was an ontological problem. In this regard, the essential is reached then by a prodigious going back accomplished by an effort of thought. As such, it could be said that the earliest philosophical speculations derived from mythologies, that is, systematic thought philosophy endeavored in its emergence to identify and understand the absolute beginning of which the cosmogonists tell, to unveil the mystery of the creation of the world. In short, the mystery of the appearance of being. It is to be noted, however, that the demythization of Greek religion and the triumph with Socrates and Plato of strict and systematic philosophy did not finally do away with mythical thoughts. Turning our attention to the examination of the contrast between myth and philosophy, from its origins onward, philosophical thinking has developed characteristics which make it different in some ways from mythical thinking. Let us summarize these characteristics thus. A. Philosophers to take a distance from traditional beliefs or opinions, not to reject them all, but to examine them critically by means of reason and its arguments. B. Human reason thus gains a certain autonomy which invites to a personal inquiry all kinds of areas of knowledge, natural phenomena, moral behavior, religious attitudes and beliefs, and so on. C. Note, however, that for quite a long time, no distinction will be made between philosophical inquiries and scientific activities. Philosophers were, for the most part, interested in knowing things as fully as they could by different means, but within one search for knowledge or science. D. The passage that took place from mythical thinking to a rational critical approach of reality should not lead us to consider that mythical consciousness was dealing exclusively with images supported by feeling. Human reason was at work in people who were at the level of mythical thinking. Study session summary. In this study section, the notions of mythical thinking and philosophical thinking were examined as methods of rational inquiry. While myths was understood as prose narratives are considered to be accounts of what happened in the remote past, philosophical thinking was understood to be an attempt at employing reason in the search for rational understanding. To this end, whereas myths are taken to be embodiment of dogma, philosophy is taken to espouse doctrines arrived at through reasoned inquiry. This is the end of study section 2. Thanks for listening.